I want to thank Brennan, Gerard, and Ryan Kelly for having a conversation with me today over Zoom. The circumstances that bring us together for this conversation are, of course, a little bit unusual. So this is the year that the Farnsworth House has been inhabited by Dr. Farnsworth's furniture, reproductions of her furniture, a collection of books that she read, first editions, as well as reproductions of her poems. And currently that exhibit sits sort of enclosed and waiting for visitors. It'll be open until December of 2020, but because this is the year of COVID, everything is closed. So this exhibition, which has been funded by the Graham Foundation and the National Trust, has been worked on by myself, Nora Wendl, in collaboration with Scott Mahaffey, the director of the house, and Rob Kleinschmidt, a local architect. It's all kind of on pause. So before it's a place people can actually visit in person, they invited me to do a series of conversations with artists, writers, historians who have also looked at the question of inhabitational histories. And of course, your work has been concerned with that for many years, and you did a beautiful chapter of your modern living project at the Farnsworth House in 2017. And so I'm really grateful, first of all, that you're available, that you had the time for this conversation about the house and the work that you've done around the question of architectural history and inhabitation. And I wondered if we could just begin with you both describing your beautiful modern living project, and also maybe describing where you are at this moment. It's April 2020, we're in late April, and of course we've all kind of paused. So maybe speaking to where you are currently at this unusual time, as well as how your project is unfolding. Thank you.
So I'm Ryan Kelly, and I can speak a little bit to Modern Living. So Modern Living is an ongoing series of performances, films, and related artworks that we create in iconic modern homes around the world, which sheltered experimental relationships or relationships that were struggling to modernize. And we've been very interested in the relationship between design and these relationships, sometimes of the architects themselves, sometimes for clients, sometimes for imagined inhabitants. We can speak to that chapter at the Villa Savoie. But basically, we've been very interested to follow this dialectic of design and relationship, and to understand how each is kind of creating the other. So it's a very different way of looking at the history of architecture through the inhabitants, through the relationships that were sheltered, without, of course, abandoning the history of forms and design innovation in the spaces themselves.
Mm-hmm. And we are, so the project is structured as chapters. Mm-hmm. Each chapter is cited in a new house, It began at the Schindler House in LA. That was the first chapter. And then it moved to Phil Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. The third chapter was at the Farnsworth House. And that was in 2017. And that was co-presented by the Farnsworth House and the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Mm-hmm. And the fourth chapter was at the Villa Savoie just this past fall, designed by Le Corbusier outside of Paris. And we are still here in Paris. We have been here for more than a year now in a residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts. And when the lockdown started and the virus was spreading in Europe, a little bit before it kind of like spread in the United States, we made the decision to stay here. And we're stuck here. but I would say for the most part, happily. And we're also here because, and we can get to this later, but we are shooting a film at the Villa Savoie that will be, because the series Modern Living is both performances, site-specific performances, but also films that are made after the performances. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So I'm curious about, of course, this year, the National Trust took on a subject this year that's kind of nationwide, and the subject is Her Turn. And the idea is turning to the histories of women who contributed to the properties that are part of the National Trust's holdings, right? So the story of Dr. Farnsworth and many other women who are part of this landscape. So I'm curious if you could maybe speak to why, for you, I mean, so this turn toward the history of the inhabitant, even though this has been going on in scholarship like Alice Friedman's for 20 years, we're just now seeing a sort of institutional turn toward that question. So now it's kind of becoming folded into like an institutional perspective. And I was wondering, you know, you started doing this work, of course, too, like Friedman, you started doing this work before it was, you know, institutionally kind of normalized. It was kind of unusual when you did it. And I know that you've had experiences where you had to sort of, you know, educate docents and others about the importance of doing this kind of thing. And so I find it really amazing. Who knows if you sort of made it possible to think through this institutionally, because, you know, 3 years later, after your modern living project in the house, it's now become sort of institutionally adapted. I think that's kind of amazing. And I wonder if you could maybe speak to why those inhabitational histories in all of these modern houses are so important in your work.
Yeah, I mean, first I'll say to that, I think the malleability of institutional history this malleability is usually, maybe historically, led by artists and writers and critics and those who kind of operate at the periphery of institutions, who constitute the institution but are not necessarily in its administration. So I think that's actually a sign of a highly functional institution, meaning that it values those kind of critical assessments from the periphery, which are there not to knock it down, but in fact to continually renew it and rebuild it. So if that is indeed what happened at the National Trust,
I think it is. I mean, I really think it shifted some thinking, which to me it's very exciting, right? To think that that's what happened. Yeah, I think you should be really happy about it. And I'm curious. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, well, that's so exciting because I think of our project Modern Living as really coming out of a generation of feminist scholarship and queer scholarship, kind of critically examining the history of art and architecture, and thinking about this. I mean, I would just say that I think that the project is part of this reckoning with modernism that I think is kind of happening in many different disciplines right now, as a way not of rejecting it, but as a way of maybe even figuring out that it might be even more radical than we thought it was.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the first things when we started the project was realizing at the Schindler House, which was designed for this 2-couple commune, that was like the first kind of case study for us, is that the architects and the clients were responding to new ways of living. They were really trying to live their lives in modern ways, and that would necessitate new design. So, and I think that it's almost thought of in the opposite way, that like the designer or the architect invents new ways of life than other people do, but it's really like the inhabitants needed structures in order to house these new modes of living or these new relationships. And then for us, it was very striking when we encountered the Farnsworth House and we realized that this was a house for a single woman. And a single woman in 1950 is a very radical position. It's actually, it was completely unusual at the time. And that she had the forethought to think about, I need a modern house in order for this modern position. Whether or not that's totally, I mean, it is conscious, but whether or not that could be articulated in quite those same terms, I'm not sure. But that we realize that the architecture is also responding to new modes of living.
Yeah.
Do you want to look at some of the images?
Oh yeah, sure. We can look
yeah.
at
That'd be great.
let me- Okay.
I'm not sure that you can see that. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, I see on the left, I see the slide, and then on the right, I see your faces.
Okay, cool. So this is a view of the house from the back of the house. There's not really a front or back, but from the side, I guess. And then this is the approach with the famous.
Right. So in the performance, there were 3 performers, 2 dancers and 1 musician. And we were very interested in the 2 dancers in this dynamic. We kind of, I guess what we landed on was that for us, the relationship that the house sheltered and was produced by was that of the architect and the client, of Mies van der Rohe and of Edith Farnsworth. This is Julia Aitken, with whom we've worked on every chapter of the project so far, so she's a long-term collaborator. That moment took quite a bit of negotiation.
I can say that is my favorite image. And do you mind speaking about what went into that? Because those curtains are just sacred. And so to see this image of this woman flailing, grabbing for the curtains, it's just my favorite image ever. And I wonder if you could talk about it.
Sure. I mean, you're very struck when visiting the house that it is a glass box. Like, it's really an intense and very special experience. And that there is nowhere to hide, in a way. So the question of the curtain became for us, it's really charged. And then in our research, Nora, thanks a lot to your work, we discovered that the curtain was this kind of very charged object in the negotiation between Dr. Farnsworth and Mies van der Rohe. That she wanted curtains. He did not want to give her curtains. They had to negotiate for these kinds of, they're translucent curtains, so they're this kind of meeting place. So for us, we really had to, it leads to questions of, and it's a moment in the performance of, what can be seen, and who can be seen, and who is looking at whom, and who has control over the gaze. And so this moment of the performance started and the entire house we had the curtains closed.
Well, that's not true. We attempted to do that, but this is one of those points of friction with the institutional histories, right? Oh, sorry.
You can do stop share.
Cool.
Yeah, you're not allowed to take a photo. I remember going to the house my first time.
Yeah.
And I walked in and the curtains were still drawn, and I was blown away because that's a really phenomenal feeling. You're in this space and the light's very muted. It's incredible. And I lifted my camera and they said, you cannot document the house with the curtains drawn. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. And that was exactly what our experience was as well. And it from what we kind of deciphered, it comes from a certain fidelity to the ways in which the architect had represented the home in his own mediation of it, right? Mm-hmm. So Mies never took pictures of the curtained house because the curtain wasn't really part of his design. It was the negotiation with the inhabitant, which is precisely why we wanted it to close. And also the overlap, if I remember, of the curtain at the beginning of a performance of a stage of a theater, a curtain opening. So if I recall, yes, we negotiated that half of the house would be closed, so that as the public arrived from the walk and circled around the outside of the house, because at the beginning, Sarah Rara of Lucky Dragons was inside the house playing really loud electronic music. The doors were closed, and Zach Winokur was underneath the house.
Yeah.
And Julia Acton was ascending the stairs, and so the public was moving around the house like a sculpture, but only half of the curtains were drawn. And I don't exactly remember that moment when she pulls the curtains. That happens later in the performance, because eventually they opened, and then at one point she draws them closed again.
It's beautiful.
This is a kind of so the performances and then the subsequent films are made up of a series of scores, choreographic scores, which are kind of like instruction pieces, songs, chants that are often derived from the speech of the architect or the inhabitant, or of critics that have written about the house. I'm recalling that from others. So this was the first choreographic score, which we call architectonic movement. And it was really a response to the to physics of the Farnsworth house and how it is negotiating gravity. So this was a first gesture, in a way, was to embody the architectonic physics of the house itself.
Yeah. I love the way that she can read the effort it takes to work against gravity in the human body, because the architecture performs it, but doesn't show you the difficulty of that performance. I think these are really amazing images.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a series of rules. Moving on right angles, you can only move, the cantilever, you could only move only one limb can be cantilevered at a time. So you're always in a kind of cantilever situation.
Yeah.
The right angles.
You're in these kind of positions that are structurally sound, but precarious at the same time, which I think, architecture is also in this place.
You can push through space, but you can't pull, which was really, that's the negotiation with gravity. You can push, but no pull.
You also get these unusual angles of the house that otherwise aren't shown. You see the rust, you see the bubbling paint, you see the underside of it. I think it's the photographs of the dancers, to me, allow the house to also be a kind of body, to see it from all of the angles. I think it's really, the project to me is really allowing a new way of seeing the structure. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's because a lot of times the first impression, or especially the impression for how it's normally imaged, that house, is that it's almost kind of floating. And actually a whole lot of work has to go inside to make that appearance of floating. And for me, all of that, what's underneath or what's working, is actually very interesting and a part of the architecture. A part of why the house is so amazing too, is that engineering. Yeah. Now, what we can show, Nora, if you'd like, is that there's a video that we have of the two performers, Julia and Zach, at the table.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay, and then this is like one of the pieces. It's a chant that we developed, and it's using a text by Mies van der Rohe. Hold on, sorry. Okay.
Should be able to tell. An architect of ability should be able to tell what he, she wants. What he, she wants. Most of the time, a client never knows. A client never knows what he, she wants. He, she may have some curious ideas. She may have some curious ideas. She may have some curious ideas. But being untrained in architecture. 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 As being untrained in architecture. They cannot know what is possible and what is not. They cannot know what is possible and what is not. Is possible and not possible. Is possible and not possible. Is possible and not possible. Possible, 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 not possible. Possible.
The spoken part is drawn from. Is it an interview that Mies gave?
Yes, it was
Yeah.
from an interview. Yeah.
So I find that, I mean, just that interaction has so many things embedded in it. And one of the things I find like fascinating is that you're bringing this sort of institutional historical narrative, and you're, which I would think of Mises' perspective as having been the sort of institutional historical perspective, right? And you're bringing it through the body of a contemporary performer. And I wonder if you could speak to that, because it's very unusual. Usually history is a series of interpretations, narratives, cycled, recycled, and sort of presented to us as coherent stories, right, with plot lines. And that's one of the reasons that that it ends up being so confused and so kind of often not true. And I love that performance at the table, because you're actually bringing something that, these are words that Mies actually said, they're revived, they're taken to the present, they're put in the body of a performer, and that performer re-performs them in a building by Mies. And I could see the people, watching it being both like moved and also slightly uncomfortable, perhaps because they're also embedded in that moment. And I just find the sort of, I really like the slightly jarring nature of it. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that process of bringing the past into the present in such a direct way.
Yeah, I think the channel to the institutional history is usually linguistic in modern living, in that there's not, it's diagrammatic and linguistic, I'd say. So
Yeah.
Very Mary Kelly, in
Yeah.
fact, as to your question beforehand about the influence of our teacher, in the sense that diagrammatic in the way that we've remapped in this case the relationship of two, of one. I think there's another chant in which we say one woe and one man, like this unit, this couple, this dyad, this binome, onto the house. So that's diagrammed by Zach and Julia, and also maybe productively triangulated by the presence of Sarah Rara, who's making music and kind of floating in and out, but not really having a relationship to the two. That's the diagrammatic. And then the linguistic is the other way that we access this institutional history. I'd say rather than kind of like a more biomorphic embodiment or characterization of people from the past, because Hollywood does that better. I'll say there's another, just to show the kind of larger scope of the performance, there was that re-speaking of Mies. There was also another score that was performed by Julia, where she's moving throughout the house, the bedroom, the living room, which was kind of our way of processing. Well, there were a few different ways we processed the language of Dr. Farnsworth, but we were very taken by, for instance, the fact that she was a scientist, a medical doctor, radiologist.
Oh, nephrologist. Yes, so doctor. Yes.
Right. Right. The X-ray house. Right.
Yes.
But then she's also a translator of Italian poetry. Right.
Yeah.
So we create this like poetic score where Julia is instructing herself the movements that she's making. Rub the knees, stretch the, rub the clavicle, bend the knees, roll the wrists. This kind of play, this sense of the body, sometimes very scientific terms, isolate the occiput. But they also sound kind of choreographic, like a dancer's monologue. And so this was like, you could see that's a very indirect way, but nonetheless linguistic way of channeling Farnsworth in the house.
Yeah, I would say that it's that we're taking that text from this interview by Mies van der Rohe, but then we're making it into a chant. So we're already kind of performing an operation on it, mainly just to hear it again, because that's one of the things about language and more conventional ways of telling history is that we read these things, we hear them, but to really hear what it is he's saying that, the client never knows. I mean, that's what he's actually saying. I mean, it's funny. I mean, if you really, and so we kind of like use these techniques of, I guess, of distancing techniques, of making something defamiliar again, defamiliarizing something. And also by transposing it onto the two, so that Julia, who's kind of channeling the Edith Farnsworth figure, has a voice inside of this song. So it's not just his voice. It's a way for us, I guess it's also just a way for us to have access to these relationships and their dynamics and what they felt like without a kind of narrative reproduction. Which actually, for me at least, I mean, is not as direct.
Yeah.
These more, you could call them more abstract strategies. I find them more direct to get at the heart of the conflict, right? Rather than, telling the story through characters playing each other, So even though there's a bit of that going on, but you're very aware when you're watching it that it's constructed. I'm going to jump, because we don't have much time, so I'm going to jump to... Sorry.
Here.
2 o'clock? 2 in the afternoon. 3 p.m. It's 3 o'clock. 4 in the afternoon. 4 p.m. 5 p.m. 5 o'clock. 6 p.m. 6 at night. Sundown. 7 p.m. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. 8 in the evening. 8. 9 p.m. 9 at night. 10. 10 o'clock. 10 in the evening. 11. 11 o'clock. Twilight. 11 p.m. Midnight. 12 a.m. 12 mattresses on the floor. First night in the house. A bare 60-watt bulb on an extension cord at midnight. 12 o'clock. Changing into my uniform.
6 p.m.
6 at night. Hotel in Durham. Up to the creek. At 6 in the evening. Dripping in mother's rings. At 6 p.m.
7 p.m.
7 at night. Nose like a broken Roman statue. Forgetting whose tongue was whose. At 7 at night. Dusk. At 7. Sundown. A breeze.
1 p.m.
Whispers fall.
1 p.m.
You called me a unicorn. At 1 p.m. Almonds from my sister's farm in California. At 1 p.m.
4 p.m.
Wine still blushing on ice.
So some of those little fragments that I remember are actually from Farnsworth's journals that we encountered through your essay.
Yeah.
Because you had done the primary research in
Yeah.
Illinois at the library.
Yeah, at the Newberry. Yeah, and I got lucky. I found them through Alice Friedman, who I discovered actually recently. I had a conversation with her too. She was the one who encouraged Farnsworth's nephew to catalog them, because when she did research, she found them in his garage. So it's a long history of things being hidden in houses before it becomes public. I know, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very helpful in that case for Dr. Farnsworth that she had this journal and she was a writer, translator. So she had this understanding of these details these fragments that we took and put into the clock that really evoke, the house. And the spectator doesn't necessarily know where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
But again, for us, that's not the point of the performance. The performance is to just kind of feel in that present moment the sense of time in a house, of domesticity, and of the details of living in that specific place. Yeah.
It's amazing how just hearing her say mattress on the floor, 60-watt bulb, it actually starts to construct it in your mind. It's incredible. Like the words are very, very powerful, and I think they were really well chosen. Do you mind if I ask about, I guess I have two maybe last questions. One is about the question of, you speak a lot about the word desire when you're writing and talking about this work, and I wondered if you could maybe speak to desire. And then I guess as a way to kind of bring the conversation together, I'm curious, in the images that we've seen and in the video that we've seen, you're enacting this performative history of Dr. Farnsworth in the house as it's presently shown, which is sort of almost an archive of Miesian objects. Mm-hmm. And there's this shift now until December where the house will actually be full of things that represent Dr. Farnsworth. And so I'm really curious about how you might see a potentially like a return to the structure in its inhabitational historical moment.
I just want to answer that with a
Okay.
image from, let's see, how do you move it back? Do you know? There, yeah. This one. I think. There. Talking about Miesian objects. This was from the Barcelona pavilion, right?
Yeah.
The sculpture, of course, a female body, nude, which we kind of transferred to Zach and to the male identifying body in the performance. But so this was kind of a way of, well, it might actually address both questions in a way, because I think it gets to a certain question about desire, about the framework of desire, which historically in representation and in the history of fine art, in painting and sculpture, is always understood as the male gaze, as the desiring male gaze, right? So to make the choice to kind of retain the object of desire, so to speak, in the nude body, this reference to the sculptural form, but to change the gender, might immediately put into question what is the desiring gaze any longer?
Whose
right?
gaze is it?
Whose gaze is it? Which is a productive kind of crisis to be in. That's maybe one way of talking to desire. But I think the other thing about desire is
well, we just want to say,
yeah.
Can I just say one thing about that? Is that was, that was a strategy and in this piece, but I think that it created, like, we know this, there was some controversy around this moment in the performance. I think that's very telling, because I think that the male body presented in this way does create a trouble, so part of what we're attempting to do is that how a desire to trouble vision or to trouble the conventional way of looking, and that sometimes creates a tension, a conflict, but that was it's a kind of deliberate move to trouble your way of looking. And I think that desire has a tendency to really trouble the way we look in productive ways, too.
I think the other thing about desire is that it's the kind of prism through which we might understand the subject, because subjectivity is formed through desire, through sexuality, through the encounter with the social world, and in motion, right? I mean, break that down, it's like we're basically these desiring little bubbles that kind of roll through this earthen landscape, literally driven, right, by these needs to interact and have contact, and at many different levels. First, the phenomenological and the kind of basic, but also beyond that into the into the linguistic, really. So desire is, we take it to be, understand it to be at the core of the formation of subjectivity. So if you're trying to address history, then I think you have to, you can't take the subject out of history. So, and if the subject is constituted in part through desire, then desire, our desire, the performer's desire, what we speculate as the desire of the historical inhabitants are kind of are the ghosts that we channel and work with on this. All of that has to be in the piece.
Yeah.
I think that that's part of the kind of corruption of institutional history, is that it often, that's often exactly what is bracketed out.
Yeah. It is bracketed out, and I wonder if part of that is, I don't want to say a taboo exactly, but what you were talking about earlier about historical narratives being a sort of abstraction, and in that abstraction of the story of the past, I think there is a tendency to sanitize things and to just look at the sort of physical manifestation of a story. So somebody's unmarried, then there's no, you know, we just sort of, I guess, when we're writing histories, maybe we're just looking at the institutionally acknowledged forms of relationships as presence of desire, but there's so much more going on, as you've been pointing to. I think that was a beautiful way of describing desire in your work. Very. So what happens next? What do you think might happen? We're in this really unusual, speaking of bubbles, we're in this strange bubble of time. And I'm curious how modern living is evolving next.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. And I mean, there's a few different things we're doing. I mean, in some ways, modern living, one part of it, right, has been an investigation of how we have and do inhabit, how we have inhabited and how we do today ourselves inhabit domestic space. So this is now a condition that most of the world, those fortunate enough to have access to shelter, are experiencing.
Yeah.
So even for those of us who have spent a lot of time critically engaging with questions of domestic life, and it's still startling. There's still a lot to be found there. So one thing that we're doing is developing kind of intensive workshop and doing it with a very interesting variety of programs, architecture and design, dance, performance, visual art, to use these tools of virtual teaching and connection to investigate our lived experiences of domestic space. So that excites me because it's a way of using this platform to maybe do something you can't do in the studio or in the classroom.
And we're projected into each other's houses. It's
Yeah.
so intimate immediately.
So intimate. There's so much information there.
Yeah.
Everything is rendered: class, gender, sexuality, race, all of it. So that's one thing we're trying to work on, is well, maybe this is an opportunity to kind of share some of these techniques of research, yeah, with practitioners that they can use in their own environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so our own houses become the case studies. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And we are also, realizing that at this time in which travel is not possible. So even though modern living as a performance is kind of, it's safer in a way, because it's the public is free to move and you could establish distance, and unlike in a theater, like theaters, this is going to be very difficult for conventional theatrical presentations. But we're also really thinking about the film component of this work. So the films that we make are not simply documentation of performance. What we showed just now or today, that's documentation of performance. So, but the films are really, we go after the performance experience, we go back to the site and we do a shoot. So the performance is this kind of research for the film. And I really mean that because by spending time on the site, you learn about the effect of light, you learn about the play of reflections, you learn about the wind, you learn about smell, the change. I mean, all of these things we attempt to bring into the film, really through embodied experience at the site. So the next film we will make is at the Villa Savoie this fall. And then we would also love to return to the Farnsworth House to make our film. We've always thought that we would do that. So hopefully that is a possibility. We're still looking for the funding and the resources to make that happen. But these are important parts of the project because at a site, these houses are small. I mean, even the Farnsworth, it's tiny. I mean, it's a tiny house. And so a lot of people can't go there. So there's a limited public to however much of a performance you have, it's limited. And the films have a way of really increasing access to these sites and to the performance. And bringing the spectator really into the experience of living in the house. And you know, the questions that are at the heart of the work. You can kind of reach more people through film. So that's what we're focused on now. Those kinds of projects seem possible in the future. So
That's wonderful. Thank you both. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Nora.
thank you, Nora.
I'm glad you're both well. Yeah, of course, it was such a pleasure, and I'm glad you're both well. And I can't wait to see the next iteration. Having seen the films, I know how beautiful they are, and I'm excited to see the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.